Hey everyone, Michael here. If you've paid even the slightest bit of attention to weird things your uncle posts on Facebook, you might have noticed a hip new boogeyman in the conspiracy theory world. Bill Gates. The Microsoft founder and second richest person alive has joined the ranks of the Rockefeller family, George Soros, the Bilderberg Group, and the Illuminati on the list of shadowy figures people would like to blame their problems on. And as it currently concerns William Henry Gates III, that problem is COVID-19. Now, theories about Gates' involvement in the coronavirus pandemic come in all shapes and sizes, ranging from so bizarre we can't even trace their connection to reality to actual facts grossly distorted to seem scarier. Rumors include Bill Gates owns the patent for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. He does not. Bill Gates will use a forthcoming vaccine to secretly implant microchips in us. He won't. And Bill Gates is trying to build a global surveillance state as foretold in the biblical book of Revelation. Also false, but in a much more complicated way. But what I find interesting about the people behind these theories, those who posit a shadowy, nefarious character that secretly controls the world with their wealth and influence, is how they often overlook the real and scary truth that's out in broad daylight. And the theories swirling around Bill Gates are no exception. Let's find out in this Wisecrack Edition on the truth about Bill Gates. Before we get into it, this video is sponsored by our patrons. And if supporting Wisecrack or not sitting through more ads appeals to you, consider becoming one by clicking right up here for ad-free access. Patreon support helps us continue our mission of entertaining and informing the world, regardless of fluctuations in ad revenue or the YouTube algorithm. Sign up now at patreon.com/wisecrack or stick around till the end of the video to hear more. Now, to preempt a lot of angry comments, Bill Gates is not only currently the second richest man on Earth, he is also one of the single most generous people on the planet in terms of the total money given away. Over the last 25 years, Bill and his wife Melinda have given over $50 billion to charity, much of it through the eponymous Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What's more, Gates has pledged to donate the majority of his $100 billion estate, and upon his death, his 3 children will each receive a $10 million inheritance, totaling approximately 1/33 of 1% of his total net worth. For scale, that's like if your parents had $1 million and left you $300. To understand how conspiracy theories often distract us from the very public, not at all secret bullshit powerful people, let's take a look at one of the most prominent Bill Gates conspiracy theories. That he is somehow going to make the entire human population get the coronavirus vaccine, a disease he purportedly invented, in order to microchip us all for, again, some vague plot to track our walks of shame to the Waffle House. This theory falls into the category of cherry-picking a few facts to tell a narrative with only the loosest relationship to reality. And that reality is a thing called ID 2020. ID 2020 is a non-profit organization loosely affiliated with the Bill Gates extended universe. While the organization doesn't list the Gates Foundation as a partner, it does list Microsoft, a company that Gates only recently resigned from the board of, and Gavi, a vaccine advocacy organization that receives substantial funding from the Gates Foundation. ID 2020's pitch is pretty simple. A legal identity is increasingly a gateway to participate in the modern world, and lots of people can't actually identify themselves. If you're homeless in America and can't prove who you are with a driver's license or social security card, getting a job, social services, or just participating in society is complicated. If you're living on Skid Row, holding on to identification in the face of rainstorms, police seizures, and theft is just really hard. Now imagine those same problems but faced by refugees looking for healthcare or people in the developing world looking to get a small business loan. ID 2020 wants to fix that with a digital identity system. It's on the cloud. Now, even though Bill Gates does not seem to be directly involved with ID 2020, he has addressed similar issues surrounding identification. And here's where the theories start. As it turns out, medical records are super important. A constant problem healthcare workers face in the developing world is wondering, for instance, who has and hasn't been inoculated against polio or measles. And the Gates Foundation, since it would like to stop children from dying of preventable diseases, partially funded research into an infrared tattoo, a quantum dot, that could provide a medical record that can't get destroyed in a flood or lost under a floorboard. People living in the developed world might take for granted how important medical records are, but every time a doctor makes sure you're on schedule for your shots or checks your known allergies, they need reliable medical records. Quantum dot tattoos or otherwise, it's fair to suppose that Gates believes identification is a key hurdle in giving people medical care. But you can probably already see how this quickly turns into fodder for conspiracy theorists. ID 2020, quantum dots, and vaccines got amalgamated into a scary theory about how Gates was trying to microchip and track people in some expansive global surveillance system. To be perfectly clear, Bill Gates is not demonically marking people or culling the population. But here's the troubling thing. Plenty of what he actually does, funds, and believes is ethically debatable at best and downright harmful at worst. And this is what makes the conspiracy theories about him so frustrating. To figure out why, I want to talk to you about disease eradication. If you watched the Decoding Bill Gates documentary on Netflix, you might have learned about how the man is committed to valiantly defeating polio and malaria.
This was this big, risky thing we were doing to help lead polio eradication.
Just a quick definition before we move on. To eradicate a disease means to bring cases of the disease to zero, everywhere, forever. Meaning, unlike Mel Gibson's career, it's never coming back. Smallpox, for instance, was declared eradicated in 1980 after a global vaccination campaign. And while there's a few lab samples left, hasn't been naturally transmitted since. Then there's malaria and polio. These diseases suck. Malaria kills hundreds of thousands of people a year, and before a global campaign against polio, hundreds of thousands of people were left paralyzed from the virus. And here I want to say that I personally believe that A, Bill Gates is a smart man who genuinely believes he's helping the world, and B, he might nevertheless be hurting science and global health policy. To show why, I want to introduce you to Dr. Arata Kochi, who is pretty much the Bobby Knight of public health. Kochi, by all accounts, is kind of a dick. But he's a dick with a good track record. He ran an extremely successful campaign against tuberculosis for the WHO before leading their charge against malaria in 2006. Kochi had a penchant for firing people as well as angering pharmaceutical companies and the nonprofits he worked for. Obviously, among those nonprofits was the Gates Foundation, which had made malaria eradication a priority in 2007. Now, eradicating malaria is really hard. Stopping smallpox, still no small feat, was at least easier because the virus can only be spread by humans. So to track down every last case, you only need to track down people. The parasite that causes malaria is a little harder to track. It spends part of its life in mosquitoes and part of it in humans. So when the Gates Foundation announced they were going to funnel money into eradicating malaria, that is, wiping it off the face of the earth, most public health experts thought it was a bad idea. It was neither feasible nor safe, as Sonia Shah writes in her book, Pandemic. Rather, experts including Kochi felt that containing the disease was a better use of resources. In other words, we could spend the money on drugs, mosquito nets, insecticides, and other measures to drastically reduce cases rather than expending endless resources trying to bring them to zero. Amidst the call for malaria eradication, Kochi, in a memo leaked to the New York Times, complained to his boss that the Gates Foundation was having a corrosive effect on the scientific process. He warned that the influence of the foundation on global health policy had dangerous consequences on the policymaking process in world health, and accused the foundation of only promoting policies that had been researched by its own grantees. In one case, Kochi accused the Gates Foundation of pushing a potentially dangerous malaria drug, a policy that just so happened to be funded by their own research dollars. Dr. Kochi wrote, although it was less and less straightforward that the health agency should recommend it, the agency's objections were met with intense and aggressive opposition from Gates-backed scientists and the foundation. The WHO, he wrote, needs to stand up to such pressures and ensure that the review of evidence is rigorously independent of vested interests. This did not happen. Instead, the WHO adopted the Gates-backed plan. Another health expert, Amir Attaran, said his experience with Gates-financed policy groups convinced him they were engaged in stomach-churning groupthink. And what happened to Kochi for speaking out about Gates? As Shah writes, he was put on gardening leave, never to be heard from again. And this is the not at all secret truth about Bill Gates. He's not a secret dictator with a shadowy agenda. Instead, he's a very rich person who can throw his money around to have his voice heard. Through his contributions to the WHO, he's also buying influence over their policies. He's no different in that way from Michael Bloomberg, who in his bid for New York City mayor famously made charitable donations to groups that were critical of him to shut them up. Or the Koch brothers, who have spent millions of dollars advancing their pet political causes. Or George Soros, who has done similarly on the opposite side of the political spectrum. You might look at the aims of Soros or Gates and call them laudable, and often many of them are. But a world where a select few decide what's good for the rest of the world basically amounts to a benevolent oligarchy. And it's not a shadowy cabal, it's just kind of how modern philanthropy works. A ton of nonprofit activity nowadays is directed in some part by grants from huge organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Koch Foundation, and also corporate donors. Looking for good PR, companies like MasterCard or Starbucks are more than eager to shell out millions of dollars to charitable causes. And hey, what's wrong with doing a good deed? The problem, like we saw with malaria, is that money often has implicit or explicit strings attached. The countless health researchers funded by the Gates Foundation might, for instance, feel less inclined to criticize the foundation's policies or its corporate benefactors. As sociologist Lindsay McGoey notes, the fact that the Gateses often fund initiatives that many people approve of should not insulate them from criticism. And to date, that's exactly what has happened. Gaping silence. The autocratic influence on the WHO is just one example. We We could also consider what it means for global health policy to enforce this top-down model. Consider Gates' mission to eradicate polio, a seriously cool idea. But the thing is, polio has already been combated so well that it doesn't even hit the top 10 list of things people in rural villages are worried about killing them. Donald Henderson, who led the WHO's successful effort to eradicate smallpox, has noted that polio vaccines have come at the expense of other, more urgent vaccinations. Henderson recounts interactions with villagers who questioned why they're being inoculated for polio instead of the much more urgent and deadly problem of measles. So is Bill Gates doing apparently noble things in all the wrong ways? Maybe, but his undue influence hasn't merely refocused public health priorities at the highest level. It's also led to a lot of other far shadier policies. James Love, the director of Knowledge Ecology International, argues that Gates uses his philanthropy to push a pro-patent agenda for pharmaceutical drugs, even in countries that are too poor to afford many patented drugs. It's a position widely criticized by the public health world. If drug companies had a little more leeway to produce generic versions of life-saving drugs, they would be able to make a dent in the millions of annual deaths from treatable diseases. And while Bill Gates recently publicly argued that a COVID-19 vaccine needs to go to those who need it the most rather than the highest bidder,
if we just let drugs and vaccines go to the highest bidders instead of to the people and the places where they're most needed, we'll have a longer, more unjust, deadlier pandemic.
He has zero interest in tweaking patent laws against his own interest, because he built his entire fortune and continues to grow it with intellectual property laws that protect Microsoft's profits. McGoey writes that his opposition may have single-handedly thwarted efforts to open pharmaceutical markets to more generic competition. But there's more. McGoey quotes NGO director James Love, who explains that the Gates Foundation funds most of the journalism on this topic, and they have been hardline advocates for strong patent protection since the 1990s, making an open discussion on the issue even more difficult. The influence of donors on the scientific community isn't just limited to the Gates Foundation. McGoey tells the story of David Healy, a psychiatrist who was offered a job by the University of Toronto in 2000. He then gave a talk discussing the limitations of clinical drug trials and revealing rare side effects, invoking the example of Prozac. Turns out, Prozac's manufacturer, Eli Lilly, is a major donor to the University of Toronto, and provided over half the funding to the department Healy was supposed to run. His job offer was retracted a few weeks later. If one cares about free and open academic debate, one has to ask what kind of debate gets squashed based on pressure from donors. And here's the frustrating thing about conspiracy theorists who see in the shadows cabals of pharmaceutical reps attempting mass mind control. If they turn on the lights, it's just the regular old free market. Which brings us back to ID 2020. It's worth noting that the stated goal of ID 2020 is to create a digital identity for people that they individually own. They're not proposing some gross centralized surveillance system. The truth, the real conspiracy if you will, is far more boring. They're building infrastructure. If you're a multinational corporation like Accenture or Microsoft, a big impediment to doing business is lack of infrastructure in the developing world. Microsoft can't sell Xboxes if cities don't have electricity or internet. Accenture can't help companies run data-driven ads if there's no data to mine. And here is the other quote-unquote conspiracy of a ton of corporate philanthropy. It's just a tax-free way to build the infrastructure your company needs. Say you're a mining company looking to extract minerals in a remote part of Africa. You need to transport supplies in and minerals out, but there's no road. You could just pay for it and mark it as an expense. Or you could work through some charity, get a grant from the government to improve infrastructure, and get the same road built for practically free. This is just a made-up example, but there's plenty of real ones that McGoey details, where government loans for charitable causes just act like venture capital on a risky new business venture. Take Vodafone, a company worth over £80 billion in 2011, which received $1 million in grants from the British government to launch a mobile payment system in parts of Africa. The system that would go on to become highly profitable for Vodafone and their subsidiaries. McGoey writes, while most people would agree that better mobile access and services in the developing regions is a positive development, many would also suggest that Vodafone should incur its own business costs, seeing as the company and its shareholders have full entitlement to all profits, minus taxes. A similar example lies in microfinance, very small loans meant to help people lift themselves out of poverty. After raising billions of dollars in grants, contributions, and government aid, the real winners of the system are Western investors, who reap billions in profits from loans with incredibly high interest rates. In this case, governments are subsidizing the risks companies take as they build up the corporate and physical infrastructure to see if they can make a buck. And with partners like MasterCard, Accenture, and Microsoft, it's not hard to see why this might be an added bonus for donating to something like ID 2020. After all, digital IDs would function as, well, digital infrastructure, laying the groundwork for all kinds of business to be conducted. Even if a person is in control of their ID, it would allow them to willingly give up their information to apply for a credit card or a microloan, or to sign away their privacy willingly in some gargantuan terms of service. And from there, MasterCard can sell that information to advertisers. And I want to be careful here, because this is the one claim I'm making that's speculative. But I don't think it's a stretch to say, somewhere down the line, there will be a disagreement in how ID 2020 operates, let's say over a privacy concern. When push comes to shove, the people writing the checks, not you or I or anyone using a digital ID in Afghanistan, will get to decide which side wins. Unlike a conspiracy theorist, I fully acknowledge that they might actually establish meaningful privacy protection. And I also know that plenty of organizations involved in ID 2020 really do just want a better way to provide healthcare to people, like the Gates-funded Gavi. There's also the argument that even if MasterCard is itching to sell data, hey, at least all that greed might end up helping some people. But one thing we do know, philanthropy can be incredibly profitable. Journalist Tim Schwab notes that the Gates Foundation has sent millions in charitable contributions to for-profit companies, some of which the foundation owns stocks or bonds in, companies like Merck, Eli Lilly, and Pfizer. Schwab also notes that, despite pledging to give away millions of dollars, Bill Gates' personal net worth continues to grow. In 2006, he was worth $50 billion. Today, he's worth $118 billion. And while Gates hasn't profited directly from his foundation, it's clear it promotes policies that protect his own financial interests. Of course, the obvious answer to all this is, it's his money, he can do what he wants. And yes, this is true, but it's worth noting he doesn't have to pay taxes on all those charitable donations. You may say this is a good thing. If I want to donate $50 to my church, which I won't be taxed on, isn't that a freer and more democratic form of giving than whatever the government decides to do with my taxes? And yes, there's a certain allure to millions of people freely choosing what causes their money goes to before Uncle Sam gets his grubby paws on it. But with someone like Gates, a single man has withheld billions of dollars in government revenue and dispersed it according to his own will. Sure, you might not like where your tax dollars are going to, but at least elected officials can be held accountable when they allocate $20 million to research cyborg murder dolphins. Or maybe we love that idea because that sounds super cool and re-elect everyone involved. Again, democracy. Now, you won't hear stuff like this from the conspiracy sphere of the internet. If you do, it might be a brief footnote in some bigger, eviler plan. But that's just the problem. We don't live in a crazy Orwellian dystopia. We live in a very boring one. And aside from eroding trust in science or causing measles outbreaks, this is another big threat from conspiracy theories. People waste their powers of skepticism chasing phantoms instead of scrutinizing the very flawed reality we live in. Even if you think Bill Gates is an angel, that every public health policy he promotes is a home run, that his money is better spent by him than Uncle Sam, you should at least consider the idea as espoused by famed poet Kanye West that no one man should have all that power. But what do you think, Wisecrack? Let us know in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for supporting the channel and our podcast. Now that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will never give us money, maybe you should become a patron. For $2 a month, you'll get ad-free access to all of our videos. And if the comments are any indication, this is something many of you deeply desire. And that's just the beginning. Higher levels can get you access to our patron-only Discord, where Wisecrack writers and hosts like me pop in to chat with fans. If you're a fan of our channel, you'll really dig everything happening on our Patreon page. And we have some really amazing things in the works that we'll be adding soon, so why not get involved now? P.S. Bill, if you're watching this, we'll make a special tier just for you. For $1,000 a month, we'll let you say you fund media coverage that vocally criticizes you. I'll also message you weekly affirmations like, forget the haters and at least you're not Mark Zuckerberg, and all for less than 1/1,000,000th of your net worth. That's a bargain. Go to patreon.com/wisecrack and join today. And once you do, message me on our Discord so you can tell me how to most efficiently organize my bookshelf. I'll see you there. Later.